Hi, I'm going to tell you about our riparian ecosystem data explorer for monitoring the lower Colorado River. It's called the Integrated and Dynamic Web-Based Delivery of Actionable Information. I'm Pamela Nagler, and my colleagues that are putting this together with me at the University of Arizona are Armando and Kamel. So I'll give you a little background. Intensification of drought across the Colorado River Basin is causing ecosystem stress and catastrophic transformations that result in increasing challenges for resource management. Over the past 2 decades, the riparian plant species on the Colorado River have declined drastically, suggesting further deterioration of biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and key ecosystem services. Researchers from the USGS, myself, and the University of Arizona, Armando and Kamel, have built an interactive, searchable Lower Colorado River data explorer for the purpose of allowing users to monitor the riparian ecosystem health and changes due to defoliation events from the Tamarisk beetle. Some of the pressures that we have here are not just due to Tamarisk beetle, but also invasive species in general, and how that affects endangered wildlife, fire, and some of these smoke and clearing and how it's affecting the atmosphere. We have diverted water sources, lack of overbank flooding and backwaters, and other land clearing, and change in precipitation and seasonal pattern of rainfall. So in many places of the American Southwest, they've undergone these environmental changes that have led to myriad restoration techniques. A lot of effort over the last 2 decades to restore this riparian vegetation has happened across this dryland ecosystem. In this specific case study, we're going to talk about the riparian reaches in the delta of the Colorado River, which have undergone reductions in green vegetation from human-induced activities that have caused water stress to plants. And the reduction is due to the diversion of surface water at the international border, groundwater losses, land clearing, fire, and minimally from changing precipitation patterns. As we know, riparian zones provide critical habitat to more than 90% of wildlife species and are very important breeding grounds and serve as avian flyways. But these unique ecosystems occupy less than 2% of this arid southwestern landscape. Riparian restoration is on the rise as our riparian areas experience deterioration and declining health, and accurate consumptive water use estimates, including transpiration rates from certain riparian species and ET for wider areas at the river reach level, are needed to begin these active restoration projects. The importance of ET is that water is the primary environmental driver of plant productivity and an important metric of the efficiency of water use. ET is a key component in the hydrological cycle and is an indicator of the resilience and resistance of vegetation under drought. The amount of vegetation is directly related to important information about how much water is lost in ET from riparian systems. And in the delta, which is a very dry river area, about 90% of the rainfall is transpired. ET knowledge helps the managers budget water for both human and natural habitat, as well as for other ecosystem services provided by flows. Accurately measured riparian ET has rarely been included for water budgets because these riparian woodlands are not as accessible in terms of ET estimates as agricultural estimates, which have often been used in place of riparian woodland estimates. What we're trying to do is produce data for the end user, and this could be linked through different areas of USGS research like landscape change, phenology, consumptive use and water availability, groundwater modeling, wildlife habitat, avian use modeling. And we wanted to provide a record of the last 2 decades of vegetation greenness for these riparian zones and their water use so that we could look at the sustainability or the riparian health along this portion of the lower Colorado River in the delta. We hope our methods and results provide information for decision makers tasked with using water, for restoring natural environments, and for planning a future with healthy riparian ecosystems. One way of looking at this is we have alfalfa as our highest amount of water use, or grass. We call that potential ET. and it's usually in the area of about 2,000 millimeters a year. Crops use almost that amount, a little less, and riparian vegetation has varied from about 450 to 1,150 millimeters a year. Cottonwood trees are at the high end of that, and between the delta and the bit of the lower Colorado River below Hoover, we see that this range in ET is between, it started out in the year 2000 at about 1,160 millimeters, and it's down to 777 millimeters over a 20-year period. And in the delta, it dropped from 1130 to 654 over that 20-year time period. So we're using remote sensing to monitor environmental changes. We have sort of a multi-sensor data product that we pull in from sat flow on the ground to eddy covariance tower and weather station information on the ground. And then we have several methods of estimating ET. There's thermal and energy balance methods by my colleague Gabriel Sine, who works for USGS in Fort Collins. And I have an optical vegetation index method. And we're applying this to riparian zones. We're using NASA imagery. We have Landsat, MODIS, and VEERS. We pulled in the European Sentinel data as well in some areas to get at this narrow riparian corridor. Remote sensing data and their techniques are able to provide an alternative to ground information and quickly and cheaply track vegetation changes that aid in the management of these riparian systems. What we did is we used both Landsat and MODIS and did it over 20 years and derived vegetation index as an estimate that goes into our algorithm to look at ET. And as we track that for the full year, we took the area under the curve of the vegetation index to estimate what we're calling a phenology assessment metric. And that area under the curve gives us an annualized ET. Research technical problems and science contributions are that we have provided for science improvements. We applied an ET method that used MODIS at the Landsat resolution. This was able to bridge an amplitude gap for vegetation index across the 3 Landsat sensors in the last 20 years. It would be Landsat 5, 7, and 8. And we looked at evaluating these phenology shifts with this annualized ET data, or we call it PAM, to evaluate the total annual water use. We also employed new analytical methods and statistical tools for evaluating time series vegetation index and water use trends. One of the things that we did was to address 2 remote sensing application problems. We looked at the challenges of differences in spatial resolution when applied to detecting these land cover changes in riparian areas, and we used multi-sensor and VI amplitude shifts in our time series data to look at changes in the Landsat sensors, so between TM5 and ETM plus and OLI. So we've ended up doing some gap filling. NDVI is shown here. You see it's a much higher amplitude than EVI, which is the best sensor to use, best vegetation index to use in these drylands. What we've done is mapped greenness, phenology, and water use. One of the things I'd mentioned was that NDVI saturates at the high end and produces an increased amplitude. So EVI performs throughout the entire range. And this is a better dynamic range so that we are now using EVI in our ET equation instead of NDVI or even the scaled NDVI. And one of the things we've done is provide the phenology year after year. This on the top right shows January to December. These are, the black is the 20-year annual curve, and you can see how the recent 10 years vegetation has really dropped in these riparian zones, almost looking near bare soil. Now in Mexico, where you have restoration sites, this phenology curve on the lower graph is much tighter. And so, except for this last year in 2019 and 2020, we have some updated data. Most of these years were higher and tighter, showing that the phenology held throughout the whole year in restoration zones for active restoration of native trees. This is a plot of water use, ET, over the last 10 years. The blue lines indicate where we had changes before pulse flow in 2014 and after is shown in the red line. So we wanted to see if surface flow had changed at all, any of the vegetation response. So here's what we built, a Lower Colorado River Data Explorer. It's an online platform to interactively visualize and analyze this remote sensing time series, these NASA products, in support of riparian studies. This is a schematic of how the data is standardized and filtered and how we do the long-term averaging using continuity equations and gap filling so that we have a clean trend data set so we can look at these changes over time, which in this lower right-hand corner you can see are declining over 20 years. As a web application, this Data Explorer provides integrated data delivery and decision support. It was developed with a modular design so it can accept new data and models as they are developed, and it is responsive to stakeholder needs for updated information. In order for this to work and evolve and become a fully functional and operational service for scientists, land and water, and cultural and resource managers, and the general public and stakeholders, our Data Explorer does four things. It has data storage requirements, it has processing resources, it has a web and tool developer time that's needed, and long-term host or a location. The current system and infrastructure is versatile and modular, so it can be ported to another location and moved to another platform such as EarthMap or GEE. So I want to quickly just show some results. Here we show Landsat and MODIS. In black and red, we show that with our data processing, we've been able to modify our ET equation here on the right side to be almost identical at these two spatial scales. Here we show year upon year with some changes pre-pulse in this upper orange dotted line, and black is the mean of 20 years, and this tinier orange dashed line is for after the pulse flow. And so that we see that before the pulse flow, our data was quite high and riparian health was good. And then it dropped over time because of these added years in the natural part, not the restored part of the riparian reaches. These have just been plummeting in the last few years, and that has had an effect on the post-pulse flow years, the last 5 years. So the surface flow really didn't help out too much in terms of riparian ecosystem health. Where we do see it helping is where we have restoration areas. And we have the transboundary area, we have the parts in Mexico where it's just declining, but the restoration is holding relatively tight up until the last year or two when we've had added days of hot temperatures and little precip. Another way to show this is to look at the annualized water use. We did on the left side is Landsat, on the right side is MODIS. We could just zoom in and talk about how we've tracked this reach by reach. This last column shows all reaches of the entire delta, and you can see this entirely declining trend. Blue is before the pulse flow, red is after the pulse flow. If you look at the percent change from year to year, you can show that there were areas of greening, like in 2009 to 2010. You have years of losses, a couple of years in a row, following that line of greening. And then when you graph it out, you can see that pretty much all of the vegetation, that going by vegetation health or greenness from the EVI, is below zero. So it's all decline, decline, decline. Zero, I'm sorry, the clear color indicates all reaches. The darker shows the largest range. So reach 2 had the largest range. We can see this in terms of line plots, the rate of change in greenness. We had this peak here in 2009 and 10, but other than that, everything is below zero pretty much. And after the pulse flow, we did see some greening, and that's this darker green box here on the upper right compared to the whole 20-year trend. So the pulse flow did help boost greenness just a little bit. We show that also in our water use estimate, so that is ET here. We made maps of our 20-year differences using scaled NDVI and also a water use on the right side. And this shouldn't say difference in NDVI, it should say a difference in NDVI star. This is the scaled NDVI that helps with illumination differences scene to scene. We can see that most areas show these giant decreases into the dark brown. And one area of green up here is in reach 4 where we do see restoration. Here's the same thing except for water use. That was over 20 years. Now we're showing over the 5-year period. So it's less dark brown and more in the medium brown. So the pulse flow did help somewhat in terms of instead of having drastic decreases, it helped boost it a little bit. And we have these same areas of greening in the restoration zones for water use, as well as in vegetation. So our major findings are that greenness in ET drastically declined by 34% and 38% of water use. But since the pulse flow, these metrics declined a little bit less, 20 and 23%. One of the things I want to point out is over here that in a few reaches, we saw declines as high as 42 to 44%, with ET as high as 2 millimeters a day. That's a giant loss in water use based on a loss in riparian health. The pulse flow did add enough subsequent water to help the restoration sites and revive riparian health. And the benefit of this water was only evident for 1 or 2 years. Overall, we see a decline of riparian vegetation from 1,130 millimeters in 2000 down to 654 in 2020, a decline of 38%. But restoration is on the rise, and our riparian areas experience deterioration and declining health. But accurate consumptive water use estimates, including transpiration rates for these riparian species and ET for the wider area, are needed to begin the active restoration projects. So we need to know what vegetation, what their rate of transpiration is, and what the water use is at the wider area. Our Data Explorer allows for the end user to search for trends and anomalies. The last thing I want to do is summarize the points for our Data Explorer. We have base data layers for the dryland riparian area Data Explorer, multi-source NASA imagery through data fusion techniques, Landsat, MODIS, VIIRS, etc. There are multiple data layers that should be considered in our Data Explorer, like vegetation index, land surface temperature, LAI, GPP, climate data, soils. A brief vision of how we have built the Data Explorer to look and function is that we have a base long-term average map of parameters related to climate and vegetation responses, the longer the better, climate and weather data, value-added climate parameters, soil moisture, ET, this kind of thing. Looking at anomaly maps that we've created that show how current status compares to the long-term or average of all the parameters. A tool that enables dynamic inspection and query of sites, areas, and regions. The tool should be smart to permit quick online inspection of the data. A projection or model tool that can project current status forward for a few weeks or seasonally and provide insights into the future of how the riparian ecosystem health metrics are progressing. The design of the Data Explorer should be the simpler the better. The closer to real, traceable data, the better. Some form of citizen science portal where citizens can provide localized data from across a large area with incentive, recognition, image of the month, something like this for acknowledgement. So that is all for the Data Explorer we've created for our riparian areas along the lower Colorado River. Thank you very much.